I just bought a saxophone last week. But here's the thing. I don't know how to play the saxophone. Or at least I didn't. Not when I bought this thing. So why buy it? Maybe it's because there's a lot that's been happening recently. Moving for work from Seattle to Vancouver in the middle of a plague. Making friends and dating during all this in a new city. And then inexplicably falling in love with a girl from back in Seattle. And proceeding to have an incredible, but also anxiety-inducing long-distance relationship that eventually became too hard for the both of us. It's fine. Really. This is fine. But, sob stories aside, why did I buy this saxophone? Something worth mentioning is that I have moderate to severe anxiety, and there's a couple of things that trigger it quite intensely, some of which are loneliness and relationships. Which really is kind of darkly comedic when you think about it. After the relationship ended, I was a total wreck. And in a cruel coincidence, my teammate on the game that I've been working on for the past 5 years let me know that they'll need to step away because life had started to become too hectic for them. Which, to be clear, is completely understandable. But for me, this news came at the worst time possible. I'd failed at keeping this relationship that I really cherished alive. I'd failed at managing to sustain this project that I'd poured all of my heart and soul into for years. I was just a total failure, in my own eyes. Now, in reality, I have a pretty comfortable life. Got a good job, cool coworkers that I enjoy being around. I have an amazing family, and a good circle of friends that I love. I also have a really fucking cute cat. Look at him, a little fucking goober. But anyway, we're talking about the saxophone, and why I bought it. At that point in time, when I was visiting home and sobbing into my mother's arms at how I was just a complete waste of space and that I would never be happy again, it was difficult to see all these things about my life that I should rightly appreciate and be thankful for. It was hard. It was really hard. Then, something magical happened. Didn't happen immediately, but there was a definite change that started to snowball into this cascading spiral of healing. I discovered something called metta, or loving kindness meditation. I recall a session where I was telling my therapist in great detail about all the ways in which I was a failure, and she interrupted me to very kindly say that while all of this was completely understandable, it also had the misfortune of being an absolute fiction, a story that I was telling myself, if you will. She called it the trance of unworthiness. And then she told me about the work of one neuroscientist and Buddhist psychologist called Tara Brach, and how she shares guided meditations and reflections on mindfulness. At the time, it didn't really sink in. I was too wrapped up in my own sense of grief and loss to really acknowledge a path to healing. I swear to God, this all builds up to the saxophone eventually. But a couple of weeks later, when I felt my anxiety welling up to the point of the dam bursting and I'm seeking any kind of relief, I went to a quiet spot, went to Tara Brach's Spotify page, picked out a guided meditation, and tried it out. And to my great surprise, deep within the gnarled, unyielding fist of anxiety that I felt in my chest, something shifted. Tears and emotions just started to pour out of me, and I just wept and wept and wept. And by the end of it, I felt that I'd taken my first real step towards healing. That I'd finally managed to connect with the grief and really acknowledge it for the first time, instead of anxiously obsessing over all the things that I could fix about myself that I viewed as broken. I kept going, doing more guided meditations and really just trying to connect with presence. And as I continued to practice, I found that my grief started to weigh less heavily on me. Perhaps most importantly, I gained a newfound ability to separate my identity from my thoughts. To my poor anxiety-riddled brain, this literally felt like unlocking a superpower. Even though I'd heard of the saying that you are not your thoughts, and I thought I'd understood it, I never really grokked what it meant. The core of it is the anxious and fear-loaded thoughts that assail us. These negative emotions and shadow parts of ourselves that we don't like to acknowledge and try to push away. Pushing them away, refusing to integrate them, is the friction that keeps us in the quicksand. These fears come from low level of our brains, right? Like bypassing our cognition centers, and they surface to protect what we view as ours. Money, social status, relationships, and so on. The natural response to these thoughts is to tense up against them, both in body and mind, and to push away. It's this refusal to tenderly nestle the part of us that fears and worries in a compassionate forgiveness, and rather we berate ourselves for even feeling this way, that keeps us in the continuing loops of anxiety and fear. It takes real intentionality to hold these parts of us close and let them know that there is in fact nothing to fear. that we appreciate them for trying to protect us, but it's okay now. We can move through the fear and over it, and when the fear is gone, only we shall remain. An analogy that I like to reflect on now is that the thoughts that roll over us are like waves in the ocean. It's so easy to mistake ourselves for the waves, to identify with the fear, to make the mistake of thinking that who we are is inextricably bound up with the things that make us unhappy. But instead, if we widen our gaze and allow ourselves to sense the instinctive truth that is buried only in this moment, in the here and now, we are not the waves that come and go. The truth of us is that we are the boundless blue. But wait, what does any of this new agey bullshit have to do with buying a motherfucking saxophone? Well, as I continued to reflect and meditate, I realized something else. That at some point, I'd allow my sense of who I was and what I could be to start to calcify. This was the music that I liked, and I'm done exploring new genres. These are the skills that I have, and that's all I can ever do. Having anxiety and fear is always going to be a part of who I am, and I can't ever do anything about that. But as I started to practice mindfulness, I came to question these deeply held beliefs. Beneath all these beliefs, there was the truth of who I am, which is someone who is deeply curious and wants to learn more and feel freedom in all things. One of the things that I'd always wanted to learn was how to play the saxophone. See, it does link back up eventually. But I'd always been intimidated by what seemed like a complex instrument. And it just seemed like a thing that other people do, you know? Like I could dream about it, but I'd never actually do it. But all of that fell away. And I just decided, you know what? Fuck it. Why the fuck not? And that's why I bought this saxophone. So now you know.